Every Tuesday, just after sunrise, 2 flatbed trucks turned off the county road and rolled through the open gate of a quiet farm outside Cedar Hollow. The drivers never knocked. They already knew where to go. Behind an old wooden barn, they backed their trucks toward a wide stretch of empty ground, pulled the gates open, and let gravity do the rest. Thousands of pounds of grapes came tumbling out. Some were crushed. Some had split open. Others had been bruised by heavy rain or left too long on the vines. A few had already started fermenting. The sweet smell of grapes mixed with the sharp scent of decay, filling the morning air around the farmhouse. To almost everyone who saw the piles, they were nothing more than waste. But to 24-year-old Hannah Reed, they were something else. They were an opportunity. For almost a year, Hannah had been accepting every load without asking for a single dollar. In fact, she kept telling the vineyard to send more. People driving past the farm began slowing down. Some stared. Others laughed. One neighbor jokingly asked whether Hannah was planning to bury something underneath the mountain of fruit. Another warned her that the smell would attract every insect in the county. Hannah never argued with them. She simply watched the piles grow. Because she knew something they didn't. Those unwanted grapes could become something worth far more than anyone imagined. But how? Why would a young woman with no farming background and no experience running a food business deliberately fill her land with thousands of pounds of fruit that everyone else wanted gone? And what had she discovered about those discarded grapes that an entire agricultural operation had completely overlooked? The answer began 18 months earlier, when Hannah's life looked nothing like the strange business she would eventually build. She had been living in a small one-bedroom apartment in Fairmont, working a marketing job that paid the bills but gave her almost no reason to get out of bed in the morning. Every day was the same. Emails. Meetings. Advertising campaigns. Products she didn't care about. By evening, she would sit alone in her apartment, scrolling through photographs of other people's lives and wondering when hers had become so disconnected from the person she thought she would become. Then her grandmother, Margaret Reed, died. And everything changed. Margaret had left Hannah 11 acres of neglected farmland outside Cedar Hollow. There was a small farmhouse with a leaning porch. A weathered barn. Rusting equipment. And several acres of land that had once been productive but had slowly disappeared beneath weeds and wild grass. Hannah drove there for the funeral. She intended to stay only a few days. Instead, she stayed. 3 days became a week. A week became a month. And eventually, Hannah quit her marketing job and moved into the farmhouse with 4 boxes of clothes and almost no idea what she was doing. The property was a mess. The fences were falling apart. The old machinery was covered in rust. The barn smelled of dust, wood, and decades of forgotten work. But there was something else. An old notebook belonging to Margaret. Hannah found it inside a wooden cabinet in the farmhouse kitchen. The pages were filled with notes about crops, weather, fermentation, preserving food, and ways to use things most people would simply throw away. Margaret had never been wealthy. She had never owned a large farm. She had never built a major business. But she had always believed that waste was usually a failure of imagination. Hannah remembered one particular habit from her childhood. Whenever she and Margaret went to the farmer's market, her grandmother would look for the bruised fruit. The misshapen fruit. The fruit that other shoppers ignored. Hannah once asked her why she didn't simply buy the perfect ones. Margaret smiled and gave her an answer Hannah never forgot. The fruit doesn't know it's supposed to be worth less. People decided that. At the time, Hannah thought it was just something her grandmother said. Years later, standing alone on those 11 acres, she finally understood what Margaret had meant. But understanding the idea didn't tell Hannah what to do with it. Until one afternoon, a vineyard manager named Daniel Mercer arrived at her property. About 3 miles down the county road was Willow Creek Vineyards, one of the largest grape growers in the region. Every harvest season, they produced enormous quantities of grapes. But not every grape could be sold. Some had been damaged by heavy rain. Some had split on the vine. Some were too soft. Others were rejected because they didn't meet the appearance standards required by buyers. And every year, the vineyard had to pay to remove them. Trucks. Fuel. Disposal fees. Labor. The costs added up quickly. Daniel had heard that Hannah had empty land. So he made her a strange offer. He would give her the unwanted grapes for free. All she had to do was allow the vineyard to dump them on her property instead of paying to transport them somewhere else. Hannah didn't even let him finish. She said yes. Daniel looked surprised. Most landowners wanted money. Others didn't want rotting fruit anywhere near their property. Hannah wanted the grapes. The first truck arrived the following Tuesday. Then another. Then another. Within weeks, the pile behind Hannah's barn had become enormous. People started talking. Her uncle called and asked whether she'd completely lost her mind. A former classmate photographed the pile and posted it online. The caption made fun of Hannah and her grape mountain. The post received dozens of laughing reactions. Hannah saw it. She didn't respond. Instead, the next morning she walked into the barn, opened Margaret's old notebook, and turned to a page she had marked the night before. She had been researching fermentation. And one fact had caught her attention. Grapes already contained exactly what fermentation needed. Natural sugars. Yeast. Water. Under the right conditions, those sugars could first become alcohol. And with oxygen and the right microorganisms, that alcohol could eventually become acetic acid. Vinegar. Hannah stared at the page for a long time. Then she looked outside at the mountain of discarded grapes. For the first time, the pile didn't look like garbage. It looked like raw material. Her idea was simple. Turn the vineyard's waste into grape vinegar. The problem was that having an idea and actually making vinegar were two very different things. Hannah's first batch failed almost immediately. She crushed several hundred pounds of grapes using an old piece of equipment she had cleaned as best she could. She put the juice and crushed fruit into large food-safe containers and waited. She expected fermentation. Instead, she got a thick film across the surface. Then came the smell. It wasn't the sharp, pleasant smell of vinegar. It was sour, rotten, and strangely sweet at the same time. Hannah opened the barn doors and stepped outside. The entire building smelled like something had died inside. She had forgotten one basic lesson. Cleanliness mattered. Her equipment hadn't been sanitized properly. Wild mold had reached the mixture before the fermentation process could develop correctly. Batch 1 was ruined. Hannah dumped it. Batch 2 looked more promising. This time, she cleaned everything carefully. The grape juice began bubbling. The liquid became cloudy. The sweet smell slowly changed. Hannah checked it every morning. For the first time, she thought she might actually be onto something. Then the fermentation stopped. The liquid had developed alcohol, but it refused to become vinegar. Hannah waited. Nothing happened. Days became weeks. She couldn't understand it. Eventually, she searched through fermentation forums and old food processing books. That's when she discovered her mistake. She had sealed the containers too tightly. The bacteria responsible for converting alcohol into vinegar needed oxygen. Hannah had accidentally created an environment where they couldn't do their job. So she changed her process. Instead of sealing the containers completely, she covered them with breathable cloth. She tried again. Batch 3 began to transform. The smell changed. The liquid sharpened. A thin layer began forming across the surface. Hannah had never seen anything like it. She had discovered what vinegar makers call the mother, a living culture that develops during acetic fermentation and can help start future batches. For the first time, Hannah realized she wasn't simply following a recipe. She was learning a process. But even batch 3 wasn't perfect. One container had been left too tightly closed. Late one night, Hannah was walking through the barn with a flashlight when she heard a sudden pop. The lid shot across the room. Hannah jumped so hard that she dropped the flashlight. For several seconds, she stood completely still in the darkness. Then she started laughing. Not because it was funny. Because after everything that had gone wrong, she had finally reached the point where failure itself had become part of the learning process. Batch 4 produced vinegar. Technically. But it was cloudy. Too harsh. And inconsistent. Some containers tasted stronger than others. Hannah had been mixing grapes from different deliveries without tracking their condition. She had no system. So she started one. She bought inexpensive pH testing supplies. She began recording temperatures. She wrote down which grape varieties produced better results. She recorded how long each batch fermented. She measured. She tested. She failed. And then she tried again. Every evening, Hannah stood inside that cold barn with a notebook in one hand and a flashlight in the other. She had no investors. No employees. No customers. No guarantee that the business would ever work. Just thousands of pounds of grapes nobody else wanted. And an old sentence from her grandmother that kept coming back to her. The fruit doesn't know it's supposed to be worth less. By the 6th batch, something finally changed. Hannah opened the container. The vinegar smelled clean. Bright. Sharp. But not unpleasant. She poured a little onto a spoon and tasted it. Then she stopped. She tasted it again. It wasn't perfect. But it was good. Really good. Hannah sat down on an overturned bucket inside the barn. For nearly a year, people had been laughing at the piles behind her farmhouse. They thought she was collecting garbage. They thought she had lost her mind. But sitting there with the taste of that first successful grape vinegar still on her tongue, Hannah realized something. Maybe they had been looking at the wrong thing. They saw rotten grapes. She saw a product. And for the first time, she could imagine putting it into a bottle. Not as an experiment. Not as a hobby. But as something people might actually pay for. She opened her notebook and wrote one more number at the top of a fresh page. Batch 6. Then underneath it, she wrote. Possible. She had no idea yet that this tiny success would eventually turn an unwanted mountain of grapes into a business worth 6 figures. But before that could happen, Hannah would have to convince someone besides herself that the vinegar was worth buying. And that was about to become the hardest test yet. The first person to taste Hannah Reed's grape vinegar wasn't a customer. It was a neighbor. Hannah poured a small amount into a glass jar, sealed it carefully, and walked across the road to an older couple who had watched the grape piles grow behind her barn for months. She handed them the jar without saying much. "Tell me honestly," she said. "If it's terrible, tell me." The woman tasted it first. Then her husband. They looked at each other. Hannah waited. Finally, the woman smiled. "This is actually good." Hannah laughed nervously. "Actually good? Better than I expected." It wasn't the glowing review Hannah had secretly hoped for. But it was enough. Over the next few days, she gave small bottles to people around Cedar Hollow. A woman at the feed store. A retired teacher. A local farmer. Her aunt. Even the former classmate who had posted the photograph making fun of her grape mountain. Hannah didn't charge anyone. She wanted honest reactions. And the reactions surprised her. People didn't just say the vinegar was good. They asked where they could buy it. That question stopped Hannah every time. Because she didn't have an answer. Not yet. Then one afternoon, her phone rang. The caller was someone Hannah had never met. His name was Lucas Bennett, and he owned a small farm-to-table restaurant about 20 minutes from Cedar Hollow. One of his suppliers had given him a bottle of Hannah's vinegar. He had tasted it in a salad dressing. Then again on roasted vegetables. Then again with a simple piece of bread. He wanted more. "How much can you make?" Lucas asked. Hannah looked around her kitchen. Then toward the barn. Then toward the thousands of pounds of grapes sitting outside. "I don't know," she admitted. Lucas laughed. "That's not exactly the answer I was hoping for. But I can make more." That was the beginning. Lucas placed Hannah's first real order. It wasn't enormous. But it was the first time someone had actually offered money for something she had created from fruit everyone else considered worthless. Hannah hung up the phone and sat quietly at the kitchen table. For months, she had been trying to prove that the idea wasn't crazy. Now someone had given her proof. She needed to turn the experiment into a business. And that meant learning an entirely new world. Licensing. Food safety. Bottling. Labels. Storage. Packaging. Pricing. Taxes. Insurance. Hannah had spent years working in marketing, so she understood branding. But she quickly discovered that creating an attractive label was the easy part. Making a food product legally and consistently was much harder. She registered the business under a simple name. Cedar Hollow Vinegar Company. She wanted the label to tell the truth. Not hide where the grapes came from. Not pretend the product was made from perfect fruit. So the first design was deliberately simple. A dark glass bottle. A plain paper label. The name of the vineyard. The harvest year. And one sentence. Made from grapes that were never meant to be sold. Hannah wasn't sure whether customers would find that inspiring or strange. Lucas loved it. "You've got a story," he told her. "People don't just buy vinegar anymore. They buy the reason it exists." His restaurant became Hannah's first regular customer. He used the vinegar in dressings, sauces, pickled vegetables, and reductions. And whenever customers asked about the unusual flavor, Lucas told them about Hannah. The woman with the grape mountain. The woman turning vineyard waste into vinegar. Within a few weeks, people began asking for bottles to take home. That created a new problem. Hannah couldn't produce enough. Her first few batches had been made in whatever containers she could afford. Now she needed proper fermentation vessels. She used nearly all the money from her first orders to buy food-grade barrels and equipment. It felt terrifying. For the first time, Hannah wasn't spending money on an experiment. She was investing in a company. She ordered 12 fermentation barrels. Then she called Daniel Mercer at Willow Creek Vineyards. "I need a more consistent supply," she told him. Daniel laughed. "You're asking for more grapes?" "Yes." "How many?" Hannah hesitated. Then gave him the number. There was silence on the other end. "You're serious?" "Very." Daniel had spent years trying to reduce the amount of unwanted fruit his vineyard produced. Now someone was asking him to increase the supply. He agreed. But this time, they changed the arrangement. Instead of simply dumping whatever grapes were rejected, Daniel's team began separating certain varieties for Hannah. That small change made a huge difference. Hannah discovered that not every grape produced the same vinegar. Some varieties created a deeper aroma. Others produced a brighter acidity. Some created a softer finish. She began keeping separate batches instead of mixing everything together. Her notebook became more detailed. Grape variety. Harvest date. Condition of fruit. Sugar level. Fermentation time. Temperature. pH. Final flavor. What had started as a desperate experiment was becoming a controlled process. But scaling the business brought another challenge. Time. Hannah was doing everything herself. She collected grapes, sorted them, cleaned equipment, managed fermentation, filtered vinegar, filled bottles, applied labels, answered customers, delivered orders, handled paperwork, and still had to maintain the farm. Some nights, she didn't leave the barn until after midnight. One cold evening, Hannah was bottling vinegar alone when she looked at the clock. 12:47 a.m. There were still 40 bottles waiting. She almost walked away. For a moment, the old doubts returned. What if this was another failed idea? What if the demand disappeared? What if the people buying her vinegar were only buying it because they liked the story? Then she picked up another bottle. Filled it. Capped it. Labeled it. And kept going. A month later, Lucas called again. He had introduced Hannah's vinegar to another restaurant owner. That restaurant wanted to place an order. Then another. Then a small specialty food shop in a nearby town contacted her. They wanted 24 bottles. It wasn't a huge order. But it changed the way Hannah looked at her business. Until that moment, she had been thinking about individual customers. Now she was thinking about distribution. The farm shop owner asked her an uncomfortable question. Can you make the same product every time? Hannah knew immediately that the answer had to be yes. Consistency was everything. A customer could forgive an unusual label. They could forgive a small producer. But they couldn't buy a bottle today that tasted completely different from the one they bought next month. So Hannah went back to the notebook. She created standard measurements. She separated grape varieties. She established fermentation periods. She recorded every batch. And she kept part of the vinegar mother alive between batches so she wouldn't have to begin from zero every time. The process became more predictable. The bottles became more consistent. And slowly, the business became more professional. Then came the first regional food festival. Hannah almost didn't attend. She thought the event would be filled with established producers with polished booths and years of experience. Her booth was tiny. A folding table. A simple sign. A few dozen bottles. And samples of 3 different grape vinegars. At first, almost nobody stopped. People walked past carrying expensive cheeses, breads, sauces, and preserves. Then one man tasted the vinegar. He stopped. What is this? Grape vinegar. He looked at the bottle. From wine grapes? Some of them. He tasted it again. Then he called his business partner over. Within an hour, Hannah had a small crowd around her table. People wanted to hear the story. Where did the grapes come from? Why were they rejected? How did she make vinegar from them? How long did it take? And, most importantly, could they buy it? Hannah went home exhausted. But something happened that she hadn't expected. A regional food distributor contacted her. They were interested in carrying the product. The potential order was much larger than anything she had ever received. Hannah read the email 3 times. Then she looked at the 12 barrels in her barn. She knew immediately. She couldn't handle that order alone. She needed help. The first person she hired was an experienced vineyard worker named Samuel Price. Samuel had worked around grapes for years. He knew how to identify damaged fruit. He understood harvest seasons. And he knew the vineyard industry better than Hannah ever could. On his first morning, he stood beside the mountain of grapes and smiled. I remember when people thought you were crazy. Hannah smiled back. So do I. Samuel laughed. Looks like they were wrong. Maybe, Hannah said. Then she handed him a pair of gloves. Let's prove it. Together, they began transforming the operation. The old equipment shed became a production room. The 12 barrels became 20. Then 30. Hannah invested in better filtration equipment. Better storage. Better bottling equipment. She also started working with Willow Creek Vineyards more closely. Instead of receiving random rejected grapes, she began requesting specific varieties. The vineyard started saving fruit that would previously have gone directly to disposal. And something unexpected happened. The relationship became profitable for both sides. Willow Creek saved money on waste disposal. Hannah received better raw material. The vineyard gained a new revenue stream from fruit that had previously been considered worthless. And Cedar Hollow Vinegar Company gained a reliable supplier. The mountain behind Hannah's barn slowly became smaller. Not because the vineyard had less waste, but because Hannah was using more of it. 2 years after the first truck arrived, the business had completely outgrown the farmhouse barn. Hannah converted an old equipment building into a proper production space. She installed new fermentation tanks, added bottling equipment, hired a second employee, and started shipping bottles beyond Cedar Hollow. Then came the number she had never imagined seeing on a business report. 6 figures in annual revenue. Hannah stared at the number for several seconds. She checked it again. Then again. She laughed. 6 figures. From grapes that people had paid to throw away. She thought about the first truck. The first pile. The jokes. The photograph online. The neighbor who had asked whether she was burying something. And she thought about Margaret. Her grandmother had never talked about business plans. She had never used words like sustainability or upcycling. She had simply refused to believe that something was worthless because it looked imperfect. Hannah finally understood. The grapes hadn't changed. People's perception of them had. The same fruit that had been rejected by supermarkets and wine producers had become the foundation of a business. And Hannah herself had changed in much the same way. She had arrived at that farm feeling like her own life had been discarded. She didn't know what she was good at anymore. She didn't know what she wanted. She didn't have a plan. But she had time. She had land. And she had inherited one simple lesson from a woman who had spent her life refusing to waste anything. The fruit doesn't know it's supposed to be worth less. Years later, Hannah still kept Margaret's old notebook. The pages were worn. The corners were bent. Some of the handwriting had faded. But she kept it in the office of Cedar Hollow Vinegar Company, right above her desk. Every year, when the grape harvest began, the first rejected loads still arrived at the farm. Only now, the trucks weren't dumping them behind the barn. They were delivering them directly to the production facility. What had once looked like a mountain of garbage had become the beginning of a supply chain. The vineyard benefited. The workers benefited. The farm benefited. Customers got a product with a story. And Hannah built a business from something almost everyone else had decided wasn't worth saving. She never became bitter about the people who had laughed. She didn't need apologies. The bottles sitting on store shelves were enough. The restaurant orders were enough. The employees who now depended on the business were enough. And perhaps most importantly, the vineyard no longer looked at its rejected grapes as garbage. They looked at them as inventory. That was the real transformation. Not the vinegar. Not the money. Not even the business. It was the way people learned to see value where they had once seen waste. Because sometimes, an opportunity doesn't arrive looking like an opportunity. Sometimes it arrives bruised. Overripe. Unwanted. And piled behind a barn. The question is whether you have the patience to look at it twice. Hannah did. And that second look changed her life. If this story reminded you that something can still have value even after everyone else has given up on it, subscribe to the channel. And tell us in the comments. What is something people once told you was worthless, but you refuse to give up on? Because sometimes, the things everyone else throws away are exactly where the next opportunity is hiding.